Hi, I'm Matthew Price, and I'm a 3D artist on the vehicle team, and I've been working on the Class 483 for the Isle of Wight, and I'm just going to show you a little bit about the process we used to make this train. I'll go a little bit over the reference first. For the Class 483, we needed to get some reference for this train. It's quite an old train, so really the only reference, like the good reference we could get is a physical kind of survey. So one of our team members went out and they took lots of images of the train, nice close-up details of the doors opening and bits of it running on the line, so that we could get a good idea of what this vehicle would look like. We also did a bunch of our own research, kind of just figuring out what the dimensions are and kind of uh, pulling apart how the things put together so that we could properly reconstruct this for TSW. And yeah, we've just got lots of pictures of the interior, all the controls that are in the passenger area. Um, we also managed to get a number of images in the cab, so we could reconstruct that as well to fairly good detail. This is a little comparison of what we've done. So this is kind of looking into the cab from the exterior, and kind of showing you some of the main controls that the driver would use, and it's even got some of the indicators illuminated in the one image here. But these are the kind of images we would use to kind of figure out what is in the cab and where it needs to go, and trying to get the sizes and stuff. And if I show you the model, hide the exterior, and I'll show you the cab, and we come around to here, you can kind of get an idea of like what we've reconstructed. So you can see we've kind of almost matched it one for one, as best we could, getting all the controls and all the little details, like the little bronze plates and the bronze kind of attachments. You can kind of see in here we've got the reverser plate, and we've kind of remodeled that as close as we could. There's also some detail down here which is quite hidden in a lot of the reference photos, but comparing between a bunch of photos and just studying the reference a lot closer, we were able to kind of make out more details in areas. So like there's this piece that kind of sticks out from the main unit with the brake on it, so I've kind of put that in there. There's also a valve down here that we've added in, and just like extra little bits and pieces that are around here, just to kind of give the overall feel and look of the cab, make it a little bit more realistic. So I'll kind of show the exterior now, and kind of a bit of the process of that. So this is the exterior of the Class 483. Looking at this, some of you might notice that there's some kind of odd things, like we have an A and a D unit for this train, but in this model I've got both the A and the D present. Same with the coupling down here. You'll kind of see that there's actually two buffers, sorry, kind of overlapped on top of each other. And the way that I've constructed this train is, because the majority of the vehicle is the same between the A and the D coach. We try and kind of reduce as much work as we can. So I've built all the differences on top of each other, and then when we go to put this into the game, we will remove all the elements that are kind of specific to one or the other train, so that we have the two different units. So in the game you'll see a D unit and an A unit, but what I work with is both the units kind of combined into one. But yeah, the way we kind of do this is we kind of get some drawings, we get a lot of photographs, and we kind of lay them out, and we kind of start modeling over this, and just trying to make sure that we get everything in the correct place. One of the things for TSW that we do, which allows us to kind of allow the scripters and the setup artists to work in alongside us, the artists, is by building a placeholder. So I will actually make a more simplified version of this train and hand that over to the setup artists, and then I will continue to actually make the final art, which is a lot higher res. Things are a lot more accurately placed. There's more detail. It just allows them to be working alongside us, and they don't have to wait for us to finish the final art. So you can see in here I've got the textures kind of placed on here with all the kind of materials in place. But if I jump over to here and do this and turn this on, you can kind of get an idea of the amounts of geometry and detail we've kind of put into our models. This model's around about 150,000 triangles, so it's fairly detailed. There's a lot of geometry on the front just to kind of make sure that we're capturing the right shape and design of the train, and we spend a lot of time focusing on the front of the train, making sure we're trying to get that looking as good as possible, so that because these are the areas that you will notice if things are a little bit off. So we do spend extra time on the front of the train, just making sure that it looks right, because that's what you want to look at when you're taking your screenshots and driving your train. You want to see the front looking as good as possible. The other thing we do is make sure that when the doors and the windows and stuff open, the inside and outside perfectly kind of meet, and we've got everything kind of working correctly, because in TSW obviously you're playing in first person, and you need to be able to climb onto the train, and you're going to get really close to these doorways, and when you're walking onto the train, it needs to feel natural and look natural. So we also spend a good bit of time making sure that this area works correctly and looks right. Another area that we kind of spend a little bit of extra time on when it comes to working on the vehicles for TSW is the undercarriage equipment. Because you can obviously walk alongside the train, you can crouch down and look at all the details and stuff. We try and put a bit more effort into replicating all of this detail down here, because it just makes the train feel more real and gives it more weight and authenticity to the vehicle. The way we normally work is after kind of completing most of the exterior, we'll start working on the interior, and generally we start with the cab, because that's the next most important place for the player to be. So we will normally use the exterior as a starting point and start building out the interior of the cab. So this is the cab model. It's a separate kind of mesh and entire kind of separate model that goes into the game from the exterior, and we kind of assemble these different pieces together in the game. And if I come inside here, you can see how we've reconstructed this. So I started with the doorways and the windows, and I kind of built my way in, and I started building the shell. And when I got to a certain point, I started kind of blocking in all the control units and where the seats are and the rear doors and all of these bits. And I spent some time trying to make sure that I was getting everything to the correct scale, placing everything so that they lined up where I could see things lining up in the photographs, and also just trying to get the angles of how all of this sits in here. The other thing we do is we've kind of put in just a bit more detail into a number of areas, making sure that we're kind of replicating all of the stuff that you can see in here. There's even like little things that you don't normally get in trains, like these fans we've set up, and yeah, we've put in a lot of little details in here. The emergency equipment. We also have the brakes working, which is quite nice. The other thing we do is we set up a lot more controls to work, so you can see these little black spikes. If I enable this, these little spikes that come out of here, these are actually skeletal bones for our mesh, and this allows us to control certain things in the model. So if I move this, we use these to control the buttons being moved. So I've set up controls for most of these buttons, and we might not necessarily make all of these buttons work, but we try and set them all up so that when the scripters come along to set up the train and enable as much stuff to work, they have the option of enabling certain features. But not all the time we want everything to work, because sometimes it doesn't make sense for us to make everything work. But you will find a lot of the elements that I have set up to work will be working. So a number of these buttons will be working, even possibly some of these breakers back here will work. If I rotate this around the right axis, they've got controls in here for them to play with. We've also got the windows set up, so the windows will come down, the strap will fold out. Obviously your main controls are all got bones in here to work with, so if I come into here, you can see there's a bone in here for controlling the brakes. And yeah, there's one for almost everything in here that the player could interact with. So that's how we kind of create the functionality for the cab area, is by having all these bones that the player can interact with and manipulate different controls and buttons. It's also how the doors and the doors open. Even the seat here has one to allow us to fold the seat up, because one of the interesting things with this train is when this seat is down, this door would not really be able to open. So to be able to open this door, we have to fold our seat up, and then we can open that door. You can see all the different bones in here that we can interact with, and then this panel has a lot of bones too for all the little buttons. We've kind of covered the exterior and the cab, and then for TSW, the last area that we put detail in, and we kind of try and do a little bit more than what we would have done in TS1, is the passenger area, because you can climb in here, you can walk about, you can sit in all the seats. We spend a bit more time making the passenger area. So this is kind of the shell for one of our passenger areas. I think this is the A coach. So in here you'll see there's no seats. We kind of place the seats in separately. It allows us to make the game run a little bit more efficiently by having the seats separate. But we put a lot of detail into the interiors. These window kind of opening levers, they've got all this detail in here to allow the windows to kind of slide down inside. You know, you've got all your buttons and signs and stuff inside here. We've even put screws and just little nice details all around the interior, just so that when you're sitting in here it looks more authentic. And if I come all the way to the back here, this is the guard room in one of the units, and even here we've kind of we've also put in bones so that we have the option of enabling some of the functionality in this area. I think this like adds a nice touch for playing the game and kind of just being able to experience the trains as a passenger. And I can show you the seats come in as a separate model, and we can place them in, and we can optimize them separately to the main shell. Because one of the things is, like, seats are usually hidden when you're outside the train, so we can actually optimize them a lot better and faster than the main body, which you would maybe see a little bit more of. So yeah, this kind of gives you an idea of what this unit looks like when it's got all its seating in, and the kind of geometry we put into here. We do try and not go too crazy with the detail, because we're trying to keep the trains as give the player decent performance when they're driving these trains. So we don't want to put too much detail into the passenger area, because they take up a lot of they can add a lot of extra polygons and triangles and overhead to the game. So we do try and be careful with that, but we also want to give the player as much detail as we can. One other little thing that we do for TSW that we've never really done in the past for TS1 is because you're a player and you need to walk around and interact with the locomotive. The engine needs to know where walls are and where doorways are, so that you don't walk through walls and stuff like that. So one of the other things we have to build for this train is a collision mesh, which is a simplified version of the model, but has like all the obstacles kind of taken into account. So if I show you, this is the exterior, and if I hide that and then show you our collision mesh, this is kind of what a collision mesh would look like for our game. So it's a very basic kind of shape of the main train, but it's got cutouts for the doorways so that the engine knows where the player can enter through into the train. And so you would be able to enter in here, but we've got these walls so that you can't pass through the dividers. And then you can come into here, which is the big open space where a lot of the seating is, but we'll normally add in other collision meshes for seats, so we don't necessarily put collision in for the seating in here, but that will get added in as a separate object in the engine. And you can see I've put in collisions so that you can't walk through the seating on here. This was just a little bit more simple, so I kind of put these in here. And then if we come through into the cab, we've also got to put in some geometry in here so that you don't walk through the controls. And yeah, we will build these out, and then what we'll do is we'll bring them into the engine and we'll walk around the train and we'll test, and we'll make sure that we're not like accidentally going through walls, and if the camera gets too close to something, it's not going inside, so we'll kind of have to readjust. One of the issues when I first built this, this panel here, you could, if you got too close to it, you would walk into it. So I had to come back in here and kind of readjust how this was working, and it just makes the engine look makes the train look a lot nicer in the engine when we create a decent collision mesh so that you can't pass through walls. But yeah, and this gives you kind of an idea, and both the units use the same collision mesh because they're so similar. There's not enough differences between them for us to use two different ones, so we just have this one big collision mesh that we kind of use for both of them. When it comes to texturing for TSW, we obviously use a PBR pipeline, which is kind of a modern way of texturing models and assets for newer game engines. So one of the pieces of software we use is Substance Painter. It's something we've been using even in TSW for a couple of years now. But the main difference between using this software to texture for TSW and TS1 is that we use more texture maps, and we use the texture that are kind of expected for a PBR pipeline, which is what Substance was originally designed for. So we can utilize the full features of the engine and give you far more realistic materials and quality looking surfaces of the vehicles that we make. This is typically what a train would look like when we bring it into Substance. We normally explode the train up so that we've got all these pieces separated from the main body, and this allows us, when we're creating shadow maps and ambient occlusion maps, which are maps that, if I show you here, give us fake shading and fake shadows. It allows us to not have odd shadows being placed. If we bake this with the doors in place and even like say the window wipers in place, it would leave odd shadows behind when we open a door or use the wipers. So we explode the mesh out, and it allows us to get a cleaner bake so that the shadows look nicer. And it also allows us to kind of more easily kind of get into certain elements and texture them separately than having to kind of work around a big mesh. One of the things we do is we kind of build up details as we go. So we'll start with a kind of basic kind of black material. We will then kind of add in height information. So one of the things I added in here is these little kind of rivets on the foot plates. They kind of get sculpted in using a painting technique to give normal detail onto the foot plates. I will then kind of add those ambient occlusion bakes and shadow bakes on top of this, so you can kind of make it out a little bit. It kind of darkens the undercarriage down and just gives a bit more definition to the model. Then the next bit, which is one of the more time-consuming bits, is kind of coming through and making all the materials and kind of filling in the overall kind of design of the train, and getting in the livery, and putting in some simple kind of weathering for the undercarriage and the main train, and getting in decals, and just kind of getting the basic clean version of this train built. Once we've kind of, we're happy with what this is looking like, and this is kind of matching what the reference has, and we've tweaked all our colors and we're kind of happy with that, we will then start adding dirt, and we normally build the dirt up with many layers. But if I turn on the dirt layer, you can see down here, if I turn it on and off, we've added a lot of dust and sand and kind of soot that kind of gets kicked up from the track. So we've got dirt down here, and on the front of the train we kind of add little bits of rain and dirt and specks that kind of get kicked up onto the front of the train. And even along the kind of the roof, we'll add in weathering, like from the sun and from rain and bits of dirt that have fallen on the train over time. And you can see along here, I've kind of spent some time because we didn't want this train to be too new, but also we didn't want it to be too dirty. We've kind of gone for like a little bit of a middle ground, and so you can see some of the paint starting to kind of fade away and wear down, and there's bits of dirt that have kind of gathered around the roof and the doorways where people are coming in and out. So a lot of dirt kind of tends to get kicked up around there. Even on the foot plates, bits of the paint start to get worn away. So we've kind of put that in there. So yeah, we've kind of this is usually the fun part, adding in the bits of dirt and kind of making it look a little bit used. The back's got like rain that's kind of streaked down and kind of slowly weathered the back of the train. It also kind of gives a nice look when you see the light kind of rolling along here. You can kind of see the dirt and grime that's kind of built up on the sides of the body of the train. And even the glass, you can see along here, kind of gets a bit of weathering from the rain that's kind of splashed against it and the dirt that's built up. So we kind of add that in, and you can maybe see little scratches and stuff sometimes on the glass. We also add in, this is when we start to kind of add in the lights and making sure those are going to work. We'll also add in, we'll make a separate texture that allows us to control what the lights look like when they're on versus when they're off. And I can show you guys that when I show you this in TSW. I normally have an adjustment layer. This is kind of just to kind of add a little bit more kind of contrast and kind of detail to the vehicle. And then the last one is like holes, and this is kind of just for adding in kind of little details like springs and sometimes little areas where I want to fill in some kind of areas that don't have anything that would actually go there, so I'll kind of fill them in with like a black material. And I guess the last thing we do is, obviously we have snow in all our vehicles. So you can see here I've got it's just a black image, but if I turn on my snow, I kind of will build a mask, and this will allow me to control where I want the snow to kind of fall on our train when it's winter. That's kind of a basic outline of our texturing process for building up and kind of weathering a locomotive. So this is the interior that I kind of textured. It's a very similar process to the exterior. We don't put as much dirt and wear into the interior because we kind of like the interiors to look a little bit fresher and nicer. And yeah, with this one I kind of built it up. You can see I brought in the seating so that I could kind of get the pattern in and kind of tile this across here. I've put in the wood because this has got a nice wood interior, and I spent some time kind of getting the kind of reflections on the wood that I noticed in our reference images to look right. And yeah, there's lots of little bits of metal and kind of different flooring surfaces that I've kind of added in. Back here it's very similar to the other end where you've got big wood palings, and yeah, there's not too much dirt. There's a bit of dirt on this back door because it's obviously one of the doors that opens to the exterior. Same with here. There's not much dirt, but there's a little bit of kind of roughness in the kind of texture, just to kind of break it up and make it a little bit more interesting to look at. And the cab, if I open up the cab for you. So the cab again is done very similar. We've got one big texture that we've kind of textured most of the elements in. We kind of built it up again with the AO and the height information that we wanted to add in for like little bits of detail that stick out from the surface. I've put in the main materials, and then I've done some aging and weathering. So if I turn that off, you'll notice a lot of these scratches and dents and bits of kind of dirt kind of disappear. So I've built it up that way. One of the other things you can see here, this is what I was mentioned about with stuff that lights up on the exterior, is we have a texture built in just for illuminating stuff. So if I jump over to the dials and I turn my emissive off, you can see this is what the texture would kind of look like when all the lights are off during the daytime and when you don't need them on. But then when you need them on, we have this extra texture that kind of layers effects on top of the main texture, and it kind of brightens everything up and makes it look like you've got lights shining on there. And then I've got a few other kind of just placeholder kind of textures built in. These are for the decals and the engraved decals that kind of go around the train, and this just makes it a little bit more easy for me to kind of control what I'm texturing on here, because you can see some of these back here. I've kind of placed them in here, and you can see where all of them would be. So they kind of get placed over the model, but I can also control them separately over here, and I can it just makes it easier to kind of put in the details and work with. And then the last thing I did when it came to this is for the passenger interior, a lot of the stuff we wanted to have a bit more detail, and to do that we've made tileable textures. So the wood is actually a big tile that goes along. Same with the flooring and the walls. So I've come in here and I've made 3 separate kind of planes that I'm gonna build my materials up on, and I just spent a few hours kind of making these and creating the tiling that we would have. And I've saved out each one of these textures, and in Unreal I've added them back into the passenger interior to kind of just give the textures a bit more detail. For this train we've got a couple of different little couplings that we've added. So this is the hard linked coupling between the 2 units, and it's just a little small kind of element that we kind of place in the engine, and it gets procedurally added in. And we've also got the front coupling, which kind of connects at the front, and we'll place these in the engine, and I can kind of show you where that goes when I show you a little bit of in the engine. You can kind of see we've got lots of little details in here. Looks quite nice. I felt getting all of these little details in, and the technique I used for this was I modeled the model that we have in the game engine, but then on top of that what I did was I added extra details in that we wouldn't normally be able to put in because it just brings the polygon count up too high. So I modeled all these little bolts and screws and things that kind of come into on the front of the coupling, and I baked them down. So these things don't actually exist. They're part of the texture. If I turn this off, you'll see they don't actually exist. So it's kind of in the texture. And if I remove that, it's gone. And if I take these off, it just becomes a flat surface. And this is the other coupling that we kind of added in. And these are just small little simple models that we kind of quickly put together, and they add a nice bit of detail to the train. This is us in the one of the editors in Unreal Engine for TSW. So this is kind of how we assemble our vehicles. So I've shown you kind of all the different pieces that we kind of put together for a train. We've got the exterior, we've got the cab, we've got the passenger interior, we have seats and couplings, and there might be other little bits and pieces depending on the train that we kind of make that need to be assembled. So in Unreal Engine we have this editor area that we kind of bring all our models in. So up here you can kind of see, if I select this, it's kind of highlighted the exterior, and this is because this is our exterior model that we've brought in. If I click here and I come inside, we've kind of got the cab area that we highlighted, and this is the cab we've brought in. And yeah, when we bring these pieces in, if we've modeled it all correctly and gotten the scale right, we can just really quickly assemble all of these components into one big train. Down here you can see where we brought in the coupling, and it just sits in there, and it kind of gets placed in by the scripters and the setup artists, and yeah, they kind of make sure that we get these all in where they need to be. We've also, if we come inside here, we can see the interior, and we've got the seats which have been added in separately and been optimized. We've got our interior shell which we've built and optimized, and yeah, we do all our optimization for Unreal in here, and we just make sure that it's going to run nicely in here. One of the other things that you can kind of see what the setup artists have done, if they've added in all the lights that are needed so that we can light up the world when we turn on the lights. You can see the red lights down here, and we've even got a little light in here to kind of light up the destination boards. And this is where most of the technical setup gets done by the scripters. We've also got lights in here to illuminate the entire passenger interior. and you can see a lot of boxes and volumes, and these are all for us to control how we open and close doors. If we come in here, you can see volumes for how we control interacting with all the elements that we want to control. So wherever I've put a bone, one of the scripters has come along and they've added in an interactive element so that you can interact with all the buttons and levers and doors and switches that you need to. This is kind of what we spend, a lot of time gets spent here making sure that we can interact and kind of work with everything that we need to in this train. And you can see here, this is kind of where we put in a lot of custom components for us to be able to do all of this. This is a little test environment. It looks very basic and bland. There's no proper ground, there's just a few tracks. There's this fake platform that I've added in. And this is where I do a lot of the testing when I'm making the art, and also the scripters have a very similar environment. So if I open this up, this will look very similar to what you see when you're walking around the engine. And this is a quick way for me to kind of get in and work on the train and make sure that what I'm making looks right for being in the engine and in a route. So I will, once we start to kind of set up the train, we'll kind of bring this in and we'll sit a train on the tracks, and we'll start interacting and seeing how see if things are working properly. I'll check if the textures are looking right. Sometimes I've put too much dirt and it looks a little bit different in the engine, so I'll kind of go back and forth between Substance and Unreal, making sure I'm getting the textures looking right. I'll sometimes have to adjust the colors of the liveries just so that things look right, because the lighting is different between the two programs. And a lot of time is kind of spent making sure that we're kind of matching our model so that it works well in the Unreal Engine and looks right compared to our reference. And yeah, this is also where I'll come and test the collision mesh that I've made, which I can show you. But once I've made a collision mesh, I'll kind of come in here and I'll start walking around the train, and I'll make sure I'm not kind of cutting through anything. I'm not falling out of the train. I can't walk through doors and things like that. And yeah, we'll come in here and we'll kind of do that. And so this is my kind of where I kind of spend a lot of my time. I don't actually spend much of my time in the routes that we're producing because for the work that I do, it takes a long time to open up a route and close a route, and when I need to be doing stuff a little bit quicker with the train, it's just easier to work in an empty environment. It's also a little bit less distracting when you're having to work in an environment where you've got platforms and trees and just all sorts of things, signals and stuff all around. It's kind of difficult to kind of just isolate what you're working on. So having this empty environment makes working on the vehicles a lot easier. So that's kind of where I spend my time when I'm in the engine. And one of the other things I can show you is just how we get the textures in. So this is the materials that we make. So we bring in all the textures that we've made in Substance, and when we export them, they will look something like this. It's just a big mess of colors and stuff that get mapped onto our model. So we'll bring these in, and then in our material area, we will create materials that allow us to do certain things. So this is what the material will look like, and we'll add in all our textures that we brought in. We'll add in the glowing material. So this is what we use to control our lights. And yeah, once we've kind of built this, it gets added into our model, and you can see them over here. They get added into the model, and they correspond to different elements of the train. So we've got an exterior texture, which is the main texture that kind of textures our livery. We've got a couple of textures for different decals that go along this train. I've got one for the bolts and rivets that kind of sit on the train. So there's so many on here that we couldn't model them, so we've had to kind of fake them in a texture. I've got a couple for the glass, for the windows, and then some for the numbers, the destination, and yeah, that's the main materials that we kind of bring in. Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I would show you the collision mesh. So if you remember what the collision mesh looked like, it's a very basic version of the model. When we bring it in, we need to kind of bring it in attached to a simple object. So I brought it in attached to this box. This box doesn't appear in the engine because we actually make it invisible. But if I turn my collision on, you can see this is what the collision mesh, what Unreal builds the collision mesh as, and I just get this wireframe view of it, and it gets added into the main blueprint, which is where we construct our train. So you can see we've hidden the mesh, so we can't see it anymore, and we hide the collision mesh so you can't see it, but it exists here and it gets added into our train. But yeah, this is what it looks like when it comes into the engine. So that's been a quick run through of how we construct a locomotive for TSW, and kind of all the bits and pieces that kind of go into building this. I hope you look forward to the Isle of Wight and driving the Class 483, and if you'd like to see more, consider subscribing.